all so much for joining us on what is going to be a most special evening, culminating a most special season. I'm just overwhelmed with all the compliments I have received, and what a great season this has been. And as someone said, it's been so wonderfully eclectic, and each concert, each program has been unique, and we're so happy to hear that, and we're so proud of that. We have a wonderful artistic advisory committee at the LSO, some of whom are probably amongst us tonight, and we have wonderful discussions, and I'm very flattered that they also, and this doesn't happen in every orchestra, take my advice seriously and my input and my experience, such as it is, and we're able to put together seasons in which the La Crosse Symphony Orchestra, I think it can be fair to say, truly punches above its weight, as they'd say in boxing. And that, of course, is the reason why tonight we're, thank you. And that, of course, is the reason why at the end of our final concert this season, the very nice folks from PBS Wisconsin have been joining us this week and are taping tonight's performance for a future broadcast, and they've been here all week, and it's truly been an honor to have them here with us. Really a very profoundly satisfying experience, and I know tonight is going to go equally as well. And we could not find a finer soloist for this grand finale program of the season than my dear old friend and colleague, Rachel Barton Pine, one of the world's great violinists and also a great Chicago resident, always born and raised, and makes Chicago proud all over the world with her great artistry and her story. And she's going to be joining us on the first half of the program, following in another spring fling ritual at the LSO. Of course, we're going to start with our two winning conductor wannabes. And it's just one of those moments where I know what you're going to say. How does he do it? Because the second of our two winners, who is devoted, as you all know, one of the beautiful things about the Conductor Wannabe competition is that all the monies that are raised, we split them evenly between the La Crosse Symphony Orchestra and the other nonprofit charity of their choice. And the winner, who is going to, well, her great cause is veterans causes, and she has been given the Franz Schubert Marche Militaire. You all know one. It's the one that goes dum ba da ba dum bum ba da ba dum bum 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 ba. Yeah. And Eric Vose, the other winning wannabe this year, who is the executive director of the La Crosse Community Theater, he gets to conduct the wedding march from Mendelssohn's music to Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. I know. How is it possible? Yes, but it happens here. And then following that frivolity, we will shift gears, I think very effortlessly, to one of the most elevated and profound works of the violin concerto repertoire, the violin concerto of Johannes Brahms. And you never need an excuse to play one of the great works of Brahms. He is, for me, even more than Beethoven, he is the very greatest of the 19th century German composers. This concerto he wrote it in an area not unlike our beautiful driftless region. He wrote it in a little town in Carinthia, which is that remote part of Austria, where he would often go for his summer holidays. And this is the mid to later 1870s, and a year before, he had written in the very same place another of his sunniest works, the Symphony Number 2, and also the horn trio. If you don't know his trio for violin, French horn, and piano, I urge you to go listen to it. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous pastoral work. Anyway, so he was in the right place in the right time, and he wrote this in collaboration with his great friend, another of the great, great musicians of the 19th century, the violinist, composer, and conductor, Joseph Joachim. And we'll maybe talk a little more about that later. Our second half, however, in a tradition in a growing tradition at the La Crosse Symphony, which you have all enabled me to do, we are going to once again celebrate the, I feel, under-recognized French classical music repertoire. I always wonder as to why, you know, I still live in Chicago, Illinois, and I occasionally go to the Chicago Symphony or the Madison Symphony, Milwaukee Symphony, because it's very interesting to me to see what they do and what they don't do. And you know, in the wider world with these multi-million-dollar orchestras, we have this obsession now with the Germanic repertoire and the Slavonic, the Russian, Eastern European repertoire. And the French repertoire always gets short shrift, aside from literally a handful of party pieces, like Ravel's Bolero or the Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, which we actually, in my 15 years, we've actually not done once but twice. There are all these other great works that have been completely forgotten. And that's not only true for composers I so hope and pray whose music I can bring to you in the future, like, oh gosh, like Paul Dukas. You know Paul Dukas, he wrote The Sorcerer's Apprentice. However, he wrote other music that is equally great and totally forgotten. The great pupil of César Franck named Albert Roussel, who left 4 glorious symphonies, which again used to be in the repertoire. Leonard Bernstein recorded them. All the big conductors of that era made recordings of it, and they've just been totally forgotten. But even when we look at Ravel, there are works that, to my astonishment, have fallen by the wayside. And at the beginning of this rehearsal cycle this week, I enacted what has now become a familiar ritual. When I opened the score for the Ravel, the Valse Noble et Sentimentale, the centerpiece of the 3 that works in the triptych we're going to do for you this evening, I asked the orchestra, you know what I asked them? You know. I said, has anyone ever played this piece before? Like 2 hands went up. And I'm trying to figure this out, why at this time in our culture especially, we're just obsessed with the kind of Germanic repertoire and the Russian repertoire, and we've left kind of France behind. And I think it's because of just the philosophy and the tradition of those very, very different individual cultures. Germanic music, this Austro-German music, is inherently uplifting. There's an inherently more, I don't mean this in a negative way, a moralistic quality. And we go to the great German composers, whether it's Brahms or J.S. Bach, when we need to be uplifted. You know, for me, Mozart is one of those go-to guys when I've been at difficult times in my life. With Russian music, with the Slavic culture, it's not unlike the Italian tradition. That kind of music is principally, again, I don't mean it disparagingly, it's about emotion, intense emotionality. And it's why, again, myself included, there are times we really need to hear that Tchaikovsky symphony or that Rachmaninoff concerto, or again, going to Italy, that great Verdi opera. You know, when I go to like the Lyric Opera of Chicago or the Metropolitan, people must think I'm some kind of freak, because when we settle into like Verdi's Aida, I just go like this. When I was a young conducting fellow at Tanglewood, I'd be in the Tanglewood shed, and I'd see these older people, you know, Seiji Ozawa would start conducting Beethoven 5 or something, people would go, I'm like, they're crazy, but now I get it. So, but French music is so, like French culture, is so uniquely different in that French music, I would say to you, French music inspires us to think. French music, like French culture, you know, we all have our stereotypes about French culture and the French and all this, but what is it really about? It's about elegance, it's about refinement, it's about craftsmanship, it's about moderation, it's about all of the, having everything in a kind of balance. And in that regard, ladies and gentlemen, Maurice Ravel is the most French of all of the great French composers. Hector Berlioz was French, but he was utterly unique. He was like, as people during his lifetime said, he was like a comet who just passed over. He was sui generis. He was utterly different from any other composer of any other nation who's ever lived. Debussy, of course, was a towering genius, but Debussy, his French Impressionism begins with the operas of Richard Wagner. It's not a coincidence that the great French Impressionist painter Renoir, you know, of course, Renoir, all those gorgeous paintings. Renoir makes the pilgrimage to Bayreuth, you know, the great shrine that Wagner had Mad King Leopold of Bavaria build for the performance, solely for the performance of his operas. Renoir takes in the first part of the Ring cycle, the Rheingold, and goes outside onto the green hill and proclaims, "I have heard the first Impressionist masterpiece in music." And so it goes back to Wagner, but Ravel is none of that. Ravel, as we know, there's a great Spanish influence in Ravel because he was born right on the border near the Basque region of Spain, near Biarritz. His mother was Basque, and she'd grown up in Madrid. His father was French-Swiss. He had been born right near the Swiss border. And Joseph Ravel was an engineer, an inventor. He was fascinated with watches, anything mechanical. And so Ravel has like the perfect DNA to become, again, I would say to you, the ultimate French composer. And the three works you're going to hear, you know, a few years back we had one of our great successes where I concocted something I called the Spanish Symphony of Ravel. We did the Rhapsody Espagnole, we did the Morning Song of a Jester, we did the Pavane for a Dead Princess, and then we ended, of course, with Bolero. Tonight we're presenting what I would call the Dance Symphony by Ravel. It's the three great orchestral masterpieces that are imbued with the spirit of the dance. And the first two out of the three of them were in Ravel's own fastidious tradition, were his own orchestrations of works he had previously written for the piano. Ravel's output was very lean, especially as late in his life he had an accident. He was getting out of a taxi and he had this severe concussion to his head. And in 1937, it was 6 or 7 years after that accident, he died of frontotemporal dementia, early 60s. He was like 62, and it's so tragic. And there are photographs of him late in his life where he'd always been the dandy, the meticulously dressed, elegant Frenchman, which led people to make assumptions about his personal life, which was always a mystery, always a mystery. We don't know. He was an intensely private man. He had no romantic relationships of any kind. He lived in a house in the country with his garden and his housekeeper, and everything was about his art and also his great friendships. You have all seen the photographs. By the late 20s, he's touring all over the world at justifiably magnificent fees. And there's a famous picture of him at a dinner party in New York with, you know, George Gershwin and Rachmaninoff. And everyone loved Ravel, but no one really, truly knew him. And the only way to know him is through the music. And it's, again, his output was lean, but every work he left us is the most beautiful gem, the most beautiful, elegant, not that this is in that class, but the Swiss watch. I mean, I don't mean that at all disparagingly. The first piece is a work called Menuet Antique, an antique minuet, which is his tribute to those equally fastidious French composers of the 18th century, like Couperin and Rameau. It's very elegant, very ancien régime, but then there are these little moments now and then of grotesquerie, moments where you think there must be a wrong note, but it's actually not, and these strange accents off the beat. It's in a simple ABA form, and again, it has the spirit of the elegance of ages past, but with a menacing, you know, fragrance at the same time. The central work in our triptych is one of my very favorite works and one of the most elusive works, even in the French repertoire, not alone the great wider repertoire. Again, a work that used to get done. When I was a little boy, I remember going to Carnegie Hall and watching Seiji Ozawa conduct it with the Boston Symphony. It used to be in the repertoire when, again, in those post-war years of American musical life, truly the greatest French orchestras in the world were in America. And not only Boston, but the Midwest, because you had the Chicago Symphony with the meticulous Hungarian maestro Fritz Reiner, who was impeccable in the French repertoire because of his fastidiousness. And then his successor, Jean Martinon. And then in Detroit, yes, Detroit, the great French conductor Paul Paré, whose recordings of Ravel I would urge you to seek out. They're glorious, glorious. So you had this American precision and excellence married to this French savoir-faire. And so I remember hearing this piece live, and it's so enchanting. And it's a piece where, ladies and gentlemen, not only do I allow you to get lost in thought during the performance, no, I demand that you get lost. No, because it's all about being lost in this hazy, gorgeous world in which Ravel is paying homage to the one German composer, having volunteered at the age of 40 for military service in World War I, and he was he was only 5'3", so he couldn't enlist, but he went to the front as a truck driver. He drove an ambulance, he drove a lorry, with taking supplies to the front. It was after the war, the only Austrian composer he still loved, which was Franz Schubert, who himself, gentle Schubert, who wrote his own piece called Noble and Sentimental Waltzes. So this is his homage to the world of Schubert, to the drawing rooms of Vienna, those Schubertiades, these wonderful evenings of wonderful people and music and ideas. It's his homage to that. The music, there's 7 or 8 different little movements, all waltzes of varying kinds. It fades intentionally into a kind of oblivion, whence we go to the world of, for me, his greatest masterpiece of all, La Valse, the waltz, which, like all great Ravel works, for orchestra, is conceived in some way as a ballet. That is the great French tradition. The Germans, the Austrians, have their tradition of absolute music, a symphony, a quartet, or a sacred work, a cantata. The Russians, the Italians, they have their operas, their dramas. The French, the core of French musical heritage is the ballet. That goes, the whole 18th century, it all goes back to the ballet. And for Ravel to think on a large scale way, he had to conceive of it as a ballet. So La Valse is what he himself termed a choreographic poem. Like Daphnis and Chloe, it was a ballet written for the great Serge Diaghilev. Diaghilev, once again, turned it down. Ravel never spoke to him again. The result is, and we have a very special guest, ladies and gentlemen, Rachel Barton Pine. I'll finish my story. Thank you. Ravel wrote this, like Daphnis, as a ballet for Diaghilev. Diaghilev then turned it down. This is 1920. And Diaghilev famously said, "I am so sorry, Mr. Ravel, this is not a ballet, it is a portrait of a ballet." To which I say, as a Connecticut Yankee, what the hell does that mean? But anyway, so he turned him down. Ravel never spoke to Diaghilev again. And then he presented this as a concert work, and he had the great satisfaction of eventually seeing it choreographed by other companies as a ballet. He gives very specific cues to the conductor in the score. There's a certain point, and if I'm doing my job, you'll know when it is. It's about rehearsal figure, I'm not going to say, but there is a note in the score where he says, "Here's the moment where we come to the Imperial Court, Vienna, 1855. So this is the glory of the Habsburg Empire, before the disastrous war with Prussia, 1866, before the catastrophe of World War I. And this is where Ravel goes as only the French could, because they invented this form, as you know. He goes from the ballet to the world of the cinema. Again, the French invented the moving picture, as you know. And suddenly, it is as if literally we have a camera from above going on to the ballroom. It's like a great MGM musical from the 50s. It is literally a cinematic moment when we are all the observers on this group of gorgeously elegant people who don't know that they are eventually waltzing their way to disaster. And that's when you know you're in the final measures of La Valse, where everything goes from joyousness and elegance to mayhem, frenzy, catastrophe. and where you imagine that in the last two bars, the orchestra becomes a kind of a giant, well, you'll see. It's horrible, but it's incredible and amazing, and I can't wait to present it to you. Once upon a time, I made a recording in Scotland, in Edinburgh, with the Scottish Chamber Orchestra of the Max Brooks Scottish Fantasy with this beautiful lady to my left, Rachel Barton Pine, and it's always great to now and then, once again, collaborate on this piece we've never done before, the Brahms.
Yeah. Should I be using this mic for the room?
You must.
Okay. Good evening. It's wonderful to be back in La Crosse. For those of you keeping track, I was last here in October of 2016. Were any of you there with us on that occasion?
Saint-Saëns.
Yeah.
Saint-Saëns.
Great to be back. And this concerto has a particularly special place in my life because not only did I spend part of my teenage years in Berlin studying with a student of Joachim. He was actually a professor in East Berlin, and then after the wall came down in '89, a couple of years later, when I was in my mid-teens and was starting to travel to Europe by myself, I would stop in and take lessons with him now that he was basically available to Westerners.
Right.
He was an elderly gentleman, Professor Werner Schultz, and his teacher had studied with Joachim, who was Brahms's best friend and collaborator and the dedicatee of this concerto. So it was about as direct a line as you could get, and just incredible advice. And the violin that I've played since 2002, which is the year that I recorded this concerto with the Chicago Symphony, is a violin with a special connection to Brahms himself. There was a protege of Brahms named Marie Soldat, one of the rare women violin soloists from the late 18 and early 1900s. Brahms had discovered her as a teenager in Vienna and had been a mentor to her for the remainder of his life. They frequently played chamber music together, with Brahms, of course, at the piano. And when she needed a great instrument for her concerts, he found an aristocratic family who agreed to purchase one for her use, and Brahms himself selected this particular violin. So it's amazing to play not only an instrument whose voice Brahms knew and loved, but also literally a violin that used to jam with Brahms. It just does everything you can imagine wanting for this concerto and more. And honestly, so this concerto is very special. It's almost like a symphony with a violin.
Yes.
The violin is not the most important person on stage.
No, you're totally the most important.
But it's not like I'm just the star of the show and the orchestra is the backup band, right? It's a true collaboration. Sometimes members or sections of the orchestra are playing the melody. I'm playing descant or counter melody. And so actually, in a way, my part is less rewarding to do in the practice rooms because sometimes it just sounds like arpeggios, but then you put it on top of the melody and it's absolutely glorious and even more rewarding than if I had all of the melodies all of the time. And so because the orchestra part is so integral, so important in a more chamber music-like way, it's rather thickly scored. And there are often balance issues where it's like, okay, the orchestra's too loud, the soloist can't be heard. Of course, we're all trying to do this without amplification. But actually, I'm now convinced that one of the reasons Brahms thought that what he wrote was just fine is because this violin that I play is particularly loud, in addition to being very gorgeous. And Marie Soldat was also one of the first champions of the Brahms concerto, which she premiered in Vienna and many other European cities. Of course, it was world premiered in Berlin by its dedicatee, her teacher, Joseph Joachim, but then she took it over. And actually, on this side of the ocean, it was also initially championed by a woman, the great Maud Powell from Illinois, who was America's first the first American-born internationally renowned violin soloist, considered to be the greatest woman violinist in the world and the greatest American violinist of either gender during her lifetime. She was one of the first artists on the planet to take it all around, and she introduced it throughout the U.S. And so what's really interesting is when I was using the Brahms Concerto as my big competition piece as a teenager in the international competitions in Europe, some of the crotchety old Eastern European judges would say, Brahms is a man's concerto, girls should play Sibelius or Tchaikovsky. But
I can only imagine what Sibelius would have thought of that statement.
But clearly Brahms didn't agree, because both Maud Powell and Marie Soldat were playing it all around during his lifetime with his blessing. But it definitely does need a certain kind of strength of playing. And what's interesting is in an article written about Marie Soldat during her lifetime, it described this violin as perfectly suiting the virile style of her playing, which was very unusual adjective to use for a woman from the Victorian era. She was perfectly feminine. If you look at pictures of her, she got married, et cetera, but she was clearly a very, very powerful player, and that's definitely what this violin inspires you to be, and indeed what the music is about.
We must go and get prepared, but I am so delighted that just the once we allowed our soloist to join us for our pre-concert talk. We could do no better. Thank you.